Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at that section I've entitled The Interlude in a Foreign Palace. That's Genesis chapter 26 in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. Genesis 26:1, now there was a famine in the land, besides the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So notice there's a different famine. There had been a famine when Abraham had first come into the land. Remember, he had gone down to Egypt. This is a different famine. Quite a number of years have passed. And so Isaac, because of this famine, he doesn't go down to Egypt. Instead, he goes to Gerar, to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. Now, we've already seen an Abimelech earlier, an Abimelech associated with Gerar. This seems to be, I can't say for sure, but it seems to be a different Abimelech. That might be has become sort of the name of all the kings of the Philistines. Just like you go to Egypt and you have a number of people named Ramses, and we number them. We go Ramses the first, second, third, fourth, and then there's Amenhotep the first, second, third, and so on. They didn't call themselves that, but this, like I said, back to Abimelech, this seems to be a sort of a tribal name, and he's living now among the Philistines. Now, the Philistines of a later era, by the time we get to the days of the judges and later on in David and the kings, we'll see Philistines living in the area along the southern coast of Canaan, and that will be their particular area. The Philistines that are living here at this time, at the time of the story that we're speaking, are not necessarily the same group of people, but we're calling themselves, we're referring to themselves, we're referring to them, not themselves, we're referring to them as Philistines in the same way I might speak of the American Indians, who never call themselves Indians. That's a designation we put on them. And so likewise, that seems to be what's happening here, but it's the area that would later on become the land of the Philistines. Genesis 26, verses 2 and 3, the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt, stay in the land of which I shall tell you, sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you, for to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands. That's both the land of Canaan and the land that will eventually be the Philistines. God says, I'm going to give all that to you, and I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands. Now, I go up into the night sky. I live in South Florida, and I don't see a lot of stars up there. That's not a big deal. But if you lived in a place where there were no street lights, like Isaac did back then, that's a lot of descendants. Think about what you see nowadays, maybe with a Hubble telescope or through astronomy. Millions and billions of stars. So there's going to be a lot of descendants, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. This is a repetition of the promise that God had given to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And he goes on to say, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws, because of that, Isaac is now being blessed as well. So Isaac lived in Gerar. Now, when the men of the place asked about his wife, he said, she is my sister. Now, that sounds very familiar, because we saw Abraham doing the same thing, and we saw Abraham doing it twice. Once when he'd gone down to Egypt, and at a much later date when he lived in the same area of Gerar. And we found out in that instance, well, she really was his half-sister. Well, here we see Isaac following in the footsteps of his father, both with regard to faith, but also with regard to fear. He said, she is my sister, and she was remember, she was not his sister, but she was his relative, his cousin, so close enough for government work. And he said, she is my sister, for he was afraid to say that she's my wife, thinking the men of the place might kill me on account of Rebekah, for she is beautiful. Now it came about when he'd been there a long time, we're not sure how long, but Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out a window and saw, and behold, Isaac was caressing. It's interesting. Isaac in the Hebrew, Isaac was Isaacing his wife, Rebecca. Remember, Isaac means laughter, but in this sense, he was more than just laughing with her. He was doing some sort of laughable things, especially if you're not married. And so Abimelech calls him on it and rebukes him, saying, look, if it hadn't been realized that she was your wife, somebody might have taken her in marriage, and now nobody had done that. There hadn't been the sort of situation that we read about with Abraham, but there had been the danger of that. And so just like Abraham had been rebuked both by the Pharaoh of Egypt, and also by the other Abimelech, if it indeed was another Abimelech. So likewise, Isaac is now rebuked. And there comes a point where Abimelech says, Isaac, this is chapter 26, verse 16, go away from us, for our numeric Cassandra says, you're too powerful. Actually, there's too many of you. So what we have here in chapter 26, first of all, Isaac had been told by God to stay in Canaan, and God gave him promises. And then the verses we've just been looking at, beginning in verse 6, where Isaac lies about Rebekah, saying she's my sister, and it's uncovered that she really isn't. She's really his wife. But even so, God blesses Isaac with abundance. And we're reminded, maybe by way of contrast, that Jesus, he willingly gave up his own life for his bride. He didn't lie to protect himself. He told the truth and then even died in our place so that we might live. Now in verse 15, we see that Isaac, he has to leave the area of Gerar, and he goes and he digs a well, and there had been wells dug in the days of Abraham in this area. And he gives names to those wells, but there's a water shortage because it's a famine, and he's continually displaced by the men of Gerar, by the Philistines, or what we call Philistines, in our day and age, from that area of that land, and he has to move first to one area and to another, and he digs a well, and then he digs a second well, and through it all, God is giving him promises and providing water as he digs these wells. And finally, at the end of the chapter, Abimelech comes and says, look, I'd like to make a covenant with you. And Isaac, actually points out that, there's been this well issue, and that's settled between them. And then God gives him I guess it's a seventh well, but also, I guess we could call the perfect well, the Beersheba, the well of sevens, or the well of perfection, or the final well maybe. And so he's given again a blessing by God. Now we come to the end of the chapter, and the scene shifts to Esau. When Esau, we read in verse 34, when Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basemat, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah. So here's Esau. He takes for himself two wives, and that's pictured as not being a good thing, because he's taking these wives of another culture, worshiping perhaps other gods, we're not told. The contrast is going to be seen here, where Esau's marriage to not one but two Hittite girls is going to be contrasted with Jacob's marriage to a daughter of Laban, although it's actually going to be, the way it turns out, it's going to be two daughters of Laban. And whereas Esau's marriage is frowned upon by the writer of the text because he's marrying outside the faith, Jacob's marriage, even though it doesn't work out quite the way he wanted it, will be blessed by God because they are going to be nominally inside the faith. And it's a reminder on the one hand that we're called when we marry. That's a very serious union. We're called to marry within the faith. We're not to be unequally yoked together. In other words, believers aren't to go out and marry unbelievers. But it's also a reminder that we have been called into a marriage union by Jesus himself, that we are called to an equal marriage union because he's going to make us like himself.